Hey everybody, this is Chris Murphy. I have the honor of representing Connecticut in the United States Senate, and I am joined tonight on this telephone town hall meeting by my good friend and colleague, Jim Himes. Thanks for doing this together, Jim.
Yeah, delighted, Chris. Really looking forward to the conversation.
So this is a telephone town hall, which means you're talking to both of us live. We are, of course, not in the same place, but connected with you on a phone call. We're going to make some opening remarks about some of the issues that are top of mind for us as we work to help Connecticut manage through this exceptional crisis. And then we're going to turn to questions from you. How you ask a question is pretty simple. At any time during this phone call, you will hit *3 on your phone. When you hit *3, you'll be connected into a representative. Just give them the general outline of the question you want to ask, and after that, you'll be connected back to the call. And then when it's your time to ask your question, the moderator will call your name and you can ask your question. We ask people to just give a little sense of what they want to ask so that we don't have too many duplicate questions and that we get as much variety as possible. We'll go for about 45 minutes and we will try to get to as many of your questions as we can, but don't worry, at the end of the call, if you stay on for the whole thing, there'll be an opportunity for you to leave a message for Jim or I or both of us. And if you leave your contact information, we'll follow up with you, have our offices follow up with you to answer your question or get you any information that you need. Listen, this is obviously nothing like any of us have ever experienced before, and we hope that we can take steps to make sure that this country and the state never has to go through anything like it again. I am learning every single day about what kind of response we need from Congress in order to help Connecticut overcome this moment. And I just stand in awe of all of the people in our state who have stepped up in just exceptional ways. Obviously, we talk the most often about our frontline workers. These are our doctors and our nurses, but also our bus drivers and our food service workers, the school security guards who are standing outside handing out meals every morning. You can go on, but we have a lot of people who are showing up to work every day and doing it despite the risk that exists to them and their family. But I also am just struck by all of the small but meaningful things that lots of other folks are doing in Connecticut. The people who are just checking in on their neighbor or making masks and giving them out in their neighborhoods. The people who are helping look after kids of relatives or friends when parents have to go in for essential jobs. It's just, a lot of folks reaching out and offering a helping hand right now in our state. And, it's hard right now to figure out how we come out of this stronger, given the fact that we have so many people out of work and we have so many people sick. But I hope that, we're learning something about ourselves during this time. Our job, obviously, is to pass legislation in Washington that helps Connecticut address the public health crisis, and then pass legislation in Congress that helps us keep our economy together and keep families whole to the extent possible until this public health and economic crisis pass. And so over the course of the call tonight, I think we'll talk about the big package that passed Congress now about 3 weeks ago and the update that was passed about a week ago. Inside that package of support is significant money to the state of Connecticut and to hospitals and nursing homes to help them fight the virus, as well as some new money last week for a brand new national testing program, but also economic help, small business supports through a essential but admittedly imperfect program run by the SBA and extended unemployment benefits. We'll be happy to talk about what may be to come as we look forward to another legislative package that may be coming before Congress in the coming weeks. I will share with you just a few of my personal priorities, issues that I've been spending some extra time working on. Today, I announced legislation that I wrote along with a senator from Wisconsin, Tammy Baldwin, that was co-sponsored by 45 of our colleagues in the Senate. That legislation would require the president to take over the supply chain for critical medical equipment, masks, but also the components of our tests. Why? Well, we simply are not producing enough personal protective equipment, and we aren't producing enough tests in order to beat this virus. Connecticut can only open up if we, essentially are doing 10 to 20 times the amount of testing we're doing right now. And we can't today envision that scenario because we have a hard time producing the cartridges and the swabs necessary to do the tests. The president and this administration have to take control of the supply chain. That's the only way that we are going to make the things necessary to do proper public health response. And we introduced legislation that would force the administration to do that. I'm also a parent of, Jim and I are sort of a rare breed. Parents of children who are still making their way through the school system. Jim's kids are a little bit older than mine, but I've got a second grader and a fifth grader, and I'm deeply fearful of the learning costs. I'm still administrators that are doing their best, but I particularly think about kids with disabilities. They're going to need to do when they get back in school, and so I've reached out across the aisle in the last week and built a coalition with a Republican senator from Louisiana. We're going to try to get some significant funding for special education in this next piece of legislation because that'll be one of the biggest needs in our schools once kids return. And it's something that we're hearing a lot about from our educators and our parents. Specific issues I've been working on, but Jim and I are working really closely together. We obviously share responsibility for representing Fairfield County, Southwest Connecticut, and we've been friends for a long time, colleagues for the last decade and a half, and I'm really glad to have him on the call to share a few opening words, and then we'll turn to your questions. Again, hit *3 on your phone. You can do it right now. You'll be connected right back to the call after you just sort of let us know what your topic is, and we'll be ready to answer your questions in a few minutes after Jim shares some opening thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And I don't want to duplicate anything you said, but thank you for hosting this conference call. And I really particularly appreciate it, you doing this in my congressional district, which is more or less Fairfield County. And the reason I say that, apart from the fact that I love my constituents, is that, as you know, and as I think everybody on this call knows, Fairfield County really has borne the brunt of this epidemic. When we were at about 2,000 deaths in the state of Connecticut, we accounted for just more than a third of that, despite being a fifth of the population of the state. And that's, of course, a function of our proximity to New York and just some early exposure associated with the situation in New Rochelle. But you're exactly right. The hospitals, the community health centers, the first responders down here have really stepped up, as have all of my constituents, as he said, really pitching in to try to make a difference in these very tough times. I won't duplicate what you said about the economic relief in the CARES Act and then the bill that we passed last week. Obviously, that was a massive amount of money, almost $3 trillion at this point, for businesses, for individuals, for schools, for distance learning, for universities to provide aid to students who are feeling the economic pinch, to very substantial amounts of money for the pursuit of more testing and ultimately a vaccine and therapeutic cures. I would like to just spend a minute on that. There's a little bit, as so often happens, of a kind of a false debate going on right now, and quite frankly, a bunch of experiments going on right now about the nature in which we reopen our economy and our social lives. And there's all sorts of discussion about whether this state is going early. And in fact, it came to the House of Representatives. I was prepared to go back for this Monday. And on the advice of the congressional physician, they ultimately made the decision to postpone that for an additional week. The point I want to emphasize here is that at the core of our economic problem, and obviously the economic problem is just devastating right now, with our economy contracting at an annualized rate of just shy of 5%, and almost 30 million Americans out of work, newly so. At the core of that, of course, is our need to solve the healthcare issue. The country is now approaching 60,000 fatalities. Those outcomes are concentrated in our elderly. our elderly are not isolated, and we see what happens inside of nursing homes and hospitals. Obviously, this disease has also particularly hit certain communities that don't have great access to primary health care. African Americans are having much worse, and Latinos are having much worse health outcomes than non-communities of color. And so we need to get a handle on that. And the scientists are telling us something pretty consistent, which is that there's a couple of things that need to happen. One, we need to really step up our testing. And as Chris mentioned, the bill that we passed last week had $25 billion for a national testing strategy and to actually buy the infrastructure to make that happen. We just need to be in a position to test at a far higher rate than we are testing today. And many of the folks on the phone will have had a frustrating experience because you wanted a test and you couldn't get one. We need to be at a point where our hospitals aren't kind of on the margin. And it's only really this week that I haven't been speaking to our hospital CEOs in Norwalk and Stanford and St. Vincent's and Greenwich about, my gosh, I'm going to run out of PPE tomorrow. And so, our hospitals really being in a position to treat an uptick in these cases is going to be essential. And then, of course, we really need to see whether this plateau that places like New York is experiencing is a real plateau, and whether new cases can be forced downward. And once we see all of those things, I think we will start to see a gradual reopening with those activities that are safer going first, populations like younger people who are less susceptible than our senior citizens, being granted more freedom. But we do need to really guard against the notion that economics demand that we go too early. It's a counterproductive argument in the sense that if we do go too early and we see a substantial uptick in fatalities and the spread of the virus, we'll be right back where we were. And the economy is in trouble as it is. It really can't sustain a double hit. And so Chris and I will be working hard to make sure that all of the resources that are necessary for things like getting our hospitals more stable, making sure that testing is available, and making sure that we're making good progress on vaccine and therapies are there. Last thing I'll say before we open it up to questions, we've obviously been consumed by this pandemic in the last month and a half or so. But the regular business of the government goes on, and Chris and I both sit on committees that are not necessarily relevant to what is happening out there right now. That you should rest assured. I sit on the Intelligence Committee, so I was on a Zoom meeting, needless to say, not classified, with members of our intelligence community to make sure that the typical and regular run-of-the-mill business that the Congress does continues. And we'll be figuring that out in the coming weeks, because not only is keeping the country running essential, but so is our constitutionally mandated role of oversight. As I said before, we've put almost $3 billion out there, and it's really essential that Congress play its role of making sure that money is well used, that it goes to the people that need to get it, and that it actually gets out there to make the difference that it needs to make. So again, Chris, thanks for organizing this, and look forward to everybody's questions.
Well, great. Again, appreciate everybody being on the call. We've got a moderator that's going to help us move through our questions, and so why don't we go to the first question that we have today.
Great, thank you. Our first question is going to be from Tracy O'Neill. Tracy, you are live on the call. Please go ahead with your question.
Oh, hi. First of all, thank you very much, Senator Murphy and Representative Himes, for all you're doing for Connecticut. I live in Greenwich, Connecticut, and obviously our area is harder hit, I should say. And so my question is about, when do you think that we will have enough tests, serological tests, that are actually accurate, and I know that's a big debate, for residents who think they may have had it, or even those who don't, number one. And number two, following up on that, contact tracing. Are we hiring people? Do we have people that we can use to do things like contact tracing in Connecticut, specifically in Fairfield, where we live?
Sure, I'll take a sort of initial crack at that. I spent a long time on the phone with the governor's team 2 nights ago, sort of working through, the initial sketches of their plan to open back up the state. My biggest worry right now is testing. We, I think, have a path to, without too much trouble, expand the number of tests we're doing by a sort of by a factor of 2 in the state. Right now we're doing, somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,000 to 4,000 tests a day. A lot of that in the last week has been constrained due to a lack of swabs. Query why we are still running out of swabs, something fairly easy to produce in this country this late in the game. But a doubling of tests does not get us to the point where we can safely reopen. As I said at the outset, you've essentially got to increase by a factor of 10. And so that plan is still somewhat reliant on the very fast change in technology. We are learning literally as we speak how to test multiple samples at a time, how to move from testing not just nasal swabs, but saliva. As you mentioned, antibody tests are going to be useful here as well. So, the reason that I'm so focused on national supply chain is that we're going to have to deliver a lot more product to the state within the next 30 days in order to go beyond a doubling of testing capacity. And I think there are still some unanswered questions. On the contact tracing, yes, that is going to be run through departments of health with the assistance of an additional core of personnel that the state is building. These are, medical students, individuals who are retired from public health fields, students, all based off of a common technology that is going to be used by all of these different departments of public health. I think one of the things that I think we need to be spending federal money on is the build out of this public health staff. Right now, the state, has to be a little careful about how big a commitment they make to hiring new staff because they don't know where that money's coming from. And so if you ask me what my priority is in the fourth legislative package that I hope Congress will pass soon, it would be specific money to help states build that tracing and quarantine support staff.
Yeah, it's Jim Himes here. I think the senator covered it well there. Just to fill in a couple of details, the 10x number is exactly right. Nationally, we're doing about 3 million tests per week right now. Raj Shah, who used to run USAID and is now president of the Rockefeller Foundation, estimates that we need to get to 30 million tests per week in about a 6-month period. He believes that that's doable. And by the way, don't read that as meaning that we're not going to be able to start opening in a 6-month period, but we need to be on that trajectory. And apart from the money, which Chris just covered very well, there's some things that we are doing and need to be doing to really turbocharge the effort. Specifically, in addition to all of those things that Chris mentioned, we have a substantial amount of testing capacity that has not come online yet because it lives in places like university research labs where they could be really contributing to the effort, but there is an FDA approval process. And so one of the things, in addition to everything related to the supply chain that Chris was talking about, is I think we really need to make an effort to make sure that those research labs, and there's a lot of them in Connecticut, places like Yale and UConn and otherwise, come online to be part of the effort.
Great. Let's go to another question.
Great, thank you. Our next question is going to be from Jessica Iannacone. Jessica, you are live. Please go ahead with your question.
Hi, thank you. So I had a multi-part question, mostly about schools. So 43 states announced that schools will not return this, and Connecticut is not one of them, so I'm just wondering why. The second part is Connecticut colleges have already been making plans in the event that students don't return in the fall, but there has been no discussion about schools not returning. And then the third part is that they're saying social distancing is going to need to continue throughout the remainder of 2020. How can that happen in Connecticut's overcrowded schools?
Maybe I'll take the first crack at that. It's Jim here. First of all, it's hard to give you a satisfying answer, just as it's hard to give Tracy a satisfying answer on when we'll have enough tests, because the honest answer is that nobody really knows. In other words, on testing, for example, we have come a long way from where we were 4 weeks ago, but we just don't know what the trajectory looks like, so it's really hard to say. As it happens, I've talked to both Governor Lamont, and I coincidentally was on the phone with Mark Nemec, who is the president of Fairfield University this morning, and neither one of them is confident in saying, because I asked them both the question, are we going to see additional school physical presence in schools this year? My sense from talking to both of them is that it is unlikely. I mean, the school year is now a month plus from wrapping up, and they weren't willing to estimate whether we'll be in a position to get back together in the fall. I do know that there is a real desire to do so. It's almost existential for our colleges and universities, because if they can't actually operate, it's hard for them to stay above water financially, but that's obviously not the driving factor here. The last thing I'll say on this is that you also have a fairly substantial difference between the advisability and safety of opening high schools, middle schools, and universities, where you can, for example, increase the amount of space between desks, and you can be relatively sure that students will comply with what would be an elaborate array of safety measures, versus preschools, elementary schools, where it's just a much more difficult challenge to get the younger students to comply with the social distancing thing. That's a little bit of a painful paradox, right? Because if you're going to reopen the economy, but you haven't reopened elementary schools and preschools, there's an awful lot of parents who simply can't go back to their jobs if they don't have a child care alternative for those youngest students. So, again, there's not an easy answer to that question, but it is a little paradoxical. I came away from both conversations fairly optimistic that there is going to be some way for the older students to get back to a physical presence at schools and universities in the fall. But please don't take that as gospel, because, as we said, nobody really knows what the trajectory of this or of the testing and other measures that are going to be necessary to get us there really looks like.
Yeah, and I would just add, the idea here, of course, is that we don't sort of open everything all back up at once, that we turn the lights back on slowly. That likely starts somewhere, well before the fall is upon us, and that will allow us to have a better understanding of, how vulnerable we are to a return of the virus. And if we start to open up some businesses in the sort of late spring and early summer, and we don't have a resurgence of the virus, then that educates us as to whether we're comfortable opening back up all of our schools in the fall as well. And our belief is that the only way to reopen is to be able to do enough tests so that we're not just testing people who are symptomatic, that we are testing in high-risk populations and high-density populations, those that are asymptomatic. Now, that's not an easy thing to do in a school. There are lots of legitimate privacy issues surrounding testing kids in school settings. But what you want to be able to do is to be doing general asymptomatic testing throughout the state, so that if you see that the virus is growing again in a particular community, you can make a localized decision about school there. I think that's the goal, is that by the fall we are able to perhaps take a sort of rewind the statewide policies and have more localized closure decisions based upon the information we get from much wider scale testing. All right, let's take another question.
Thank you. Our next question is from Frank Hawkins. Frank, you are live on the call. Please go ahead with your question.
Hi, I'm in Darien right now, and I very much appreciate your doing this. And I'm going to throw you a curveball because I'm originally from Sioux Falls, South Dakota, which is where they have the Smithfield plant that had the large meatpacking outbreak. How is it that Congress might be able to influence the liability shield piece of what President Trump may be trying to do with the meatpacking order. I'm very worried. My various relatives worked at Morrell's for a long period of time, and I know how dangerous it is, and I'm very worried that the liability shield provisions that might be put in place to get the meatpacking plants to be opened will be very detrimental to worker safety going forward, and worse yet, could become a pattern for forcing things to remain open in unsafe conditions as the pandemic moves forward.
I share your concerns. This is an announcement the administration just made yesterday, and I will admit to not having reviewed the details of it yet. There was, as you mentioned, this reference to the provision of some legal immunity for the industry. There's some irony involved in the fact that the president is willing to use the Defense Production Act, which gives him these powers to essentially require production to be done in various industries. There's some irony that he's willing to use that in the meatpacking industry, but he's not willing to use that power to make more masks or ventilators or testing cartridges. Seems like the priorities of this administration in terms of how it uses the Defense Production Act are pretty screwed up. I hate the fact that we continue to come back to this same word, testing, but it is so essential to opening any business or school or community back up. And so what I worry is that if you're opening meat processing or packing facilities and not testing both symptomatic and asymptomatic individuals, then you are really putting those workers at risk. So I've sort of begun to ask these questions today, my colleagues and I have, of the administration, because if you are commanding a factory to open back up, I think you have an obligation as the federal government to then deliver them the testing capacity so that they can test a sampling of all workers to understand whether the virus is spreading, and then to make decisions about whether you can keep that facility open or need to shutter it again. Want to jump to the next question? Let's jump to the next one.
Yeah, I think that covered it.
Perfect. Our next question is from Dan DeClerc. Dan, you are live on the call. Please go ahead with your question.
Hey, thanks for what you're doing. I think it's terrific. My question is PPP related. My business cycle doesn't really work for the June 30th to bring everybody back and have us fully up to speed by June 30th. I'm wondering if there's going to be a phase 2 for PPP, which might be maturing maybe end of August or end of September.
Yeah, let me start on that one. So the answer to your question is yes. It has proven to be an enormously popular program, even if we've discovered that the speed with which it was implemented and the fact that it's implemented by banks, which of course made sense since banks are traditional 7A lenders and they know how to do these loans, means that a lot of people got left out. It also means, and for example, I think Chris and I have heard amply from the restaurant industry, which you know, the industry doesn't really fit well into the parameters of PPP for a bunch of reasons. So I would point to the fact that in the last bill that we passed last week, we tried to address some of the issues with the program by doing a $60 billion set-aside for the smallest banks and the smallest credit unions and community development finance institutions, because one of the problems with the program, and this is not relevant to what you're saying, but it's an illustration of the desire to try to tailor the program to more people. There was a $60 billion set aside of the $310 billion for the smallest institutions to really go out there and find and lend to the to the less sophisticated, less connected businesses out there. So yes, I mentioned the restaurant industry. They've done a very aggressive job at pointing out how they haven't really been able to adequately take advantage of the program, that the expiration of the program's 2.5 months forgivability on wages is very, very hard for them, because obviously they'll either be able to open or they won't, and if they can't open, they can't pay their employees. They've got no revenue. So that's a long-winded way of saying it is an enormously popular program. It has very strong bipartisan support. We're seeing the demand. And so I think this is the moment to do what we did in the last couple of weeks and just say, how can we make it more applicable and more flexible to keep more people employed? So I would urge you to reach out to, if I'm your representative and Chris is your senator, to reach out to our offices to make sure we understand your particular situation.
Listen, we sometimes feel these days like we are sort of small business administrations, because I think the bulk of the work that we're doing right now is trying to help businesses manage the PPP program. I would have liked to have seen more changes built into the reauthorization. We ran through the first $300 billion very quickly, and we reauthorized the program to get us at least through the next several weeks, but without a lot of changes to the program itself. I think what you're identifying is a really important question. The PPP is designed for a period of time in which the economy is effectively shuttered. You sort of raised this question, which is, well, what happens when the economy starts to reopen? Most businesses are not going to be operating at the same revenue level that they were. Some will be directly affected by continued social distancing measures. For instance, the hospitality industry is likely going to be told that they can have X number of people in their facility at any given time. And so how do we acknowledge that dramatic shortfall that's going to exist between, expected revenue and real revenue? And I don't know that PPP is necessarily the right program for that. That's really just designed to, help pay your employees through the crisis. Once the economy reopens, I think there is a need for a follow-on program, but it probably looks a little different, and it may be tailored to specific industries that are no doubt going to have a hard time ramping back up when this is all done. Reopen, we're going to have potentially 25% of Americans without a job. That means not a lot of customers coming through the door, and we're going to have some new follow-on to PPP, I believe, to deal with that. All right, next question.
Thank you. Our next question is from Jean Sweeney. Jean, you are live on the call. Please go ahead with your question.
Oh, yes. Hi. Thank you, Senator Murphy and Congressman Himes. So something came across my social media saying that the distribution of the Paycheck Protection Act monies seems to not be as equitably distributed to women and minority-owned businesses. And I'm just wondering, because the Equal Rights Amendment has, we have 38 states that have ratified, but the administration is not allowing it to be added to the Constitution, and the Senate has not voted on SJ Res 6. I'm just wondering, does that bill have protections in there against the government discriminating against women?
It does. Every SBA-run program is subject to anti-discrimination law. But as you know, there's overt discrimination, and then there's sort of implicit foundational discrimination. And what's happening is that banks are giving preference to existing customers. Remember, this PPP program gives out money to businesses up to 500 employees, and in some cases higher than that, depending on your industry. And so, while there are true mom and pop businesses that are getting help, the banks are giving preference to their bigger small business customers. And let's face it, those bigger small business customers tend to be led by men, and often white men. It is minority-owned and women-owned businesses that tend to be often the smaller businesses, and they have been forced to wait in line. And so the intent here is not gender discrimination or racial discrimination, but the outcome is that there's a disparate treatment. And when I talk about the changes that I think we should make, that's one of them. Jim, I think, very rightly pointed out our attempts to solve for that. So we couldn't convince Republicans to change the actual parameters of the PPP program, but we were able to convince them to set up this separate fund for very small banks who tend to have more relationships with smaller businesses that may be owned by people of color, women. So we hope that will unlock some of the problem here, solve some of the problem. But yeah, we've got work to do here. I think it's really important that we acknowledge some of the failings of the PPP program in that regard. All right, take another question.
Great, thank you. Our next question is from Kathy Peterson. Kathy, you are live. Please go ahead with your question.
Hi, good evening. Thanks for taking my question. I'm a 65-year-old woman, and I live in Black Rock in Connecticut. I understand about the social distancing. I've been practicing staying at home as much as possible, social distancing, as are my family members. But I have found somewhat of a lackadaisical practice of the recommendations in this area in particular. And people that I've actually stopped to speak to when they haven't been wearing a mask in a public place seem not well educated on why that's necessary, to have a face covering or a mask and to practice the 6-foot distance from other people. And I'm wondering, what do you think could be done to impress upon people how important that's going to be, especially since there are conversations beginning about reopening businesses and perhaps schools and et cetera. I think it's kind of urgent that we impress upon people the importance of this going forward.
Yeah, Kathy, that's a really good point, and in some ways, Chris and I are as federal officials are probably officials as distant from what happens on on Fairfield Avenue in Black Rock as anyone. A lot of our time has been spent trying to disseminate good information, and I'm just constantly pointing to the CDC.gov website, to the Connecticut.gov health website, because they contain very clear statements of what people should be doing. But when I say what I do about the federal government, I'm on Emergency Operations Center calls every day, and our mayors and first selectmen are really trying to figure out what the right balance is of having police enforce these things. And generally the balance that has been struck around the county is one where, police are being constructive and reminding people not to congregate. And but it's a tough question. We don't, our towns and cities don't have the resources to really patrol to make sure that there aren't violations of these things. So it really relies on those of us in positions of responsibility just constantly reiterating the message, and quite frankly, folks like you. Reminding people, and the tensions are running high out there. I've seen more than one incident out there where people who've been cooped up for a long time and are living under a lot of stress, get into little arguments over, whether a jogger should be wearing a mask. And to be fair, it is a little bewildering. I mean, 6 weeks ago, there wasn't the very strong mandate on, or there wasn't clarity on whether and how wearing a mask protected people. So I do think that there's a combination of frustration out there, a fairly high degree of stress from people who've been cooped up and away from their jobs and away from their hobbies and things like entertainment for a very long time. But again, hopefully all of us can play a role in making sure, and pointing out in a constructive and polite way when people are engaging in behaviors that, that could spread this thing.
Great. I think that covers it well. We've got time for a couple more questions.
Absolutely. Our next question is from Christine Taylor. Christine, you are live on the call. Please go ahead with your question.
Okay. Thank you to both of you for your great representation of us in Washington. My question is regarding the election, paper ballots, and mail-in ballots. The Connecticut legislature has already closed, right, for this session, and I'm very concerned about us having that option here in Connecticut. So is there going to be any federal action taken, and also in line with the concerns about the post office. I want to be able to have a paper ballot, and I want to be able to mail it in. Is there any possibility that's going to happen?
So it's a really good question. We somehow in Connecticut, we have saddled ourselves with one of the most restrictive voting systems in the nation. There are very few states left, like Connecticut, where you have no broad ability to cast a mail-in vote and you have no ability to vote early. We are bound by a constitutional provision in Connecticut that must be changed in order to be able to do mail-in and early voting. So it's not as easy as the state legislature just coming in and changing the law. That means by November, we can't pass a law that allows us to do a mail-in voting system like the ones you see in other states. But there is hope. Connecticut does have absentee ballots. Now, they're not the same as mail-in votes because you have to send away for the absentee ballot, comes to your house, then you send it in. It's a two-step process. But I believe, and I think the Secretary of State believes, that the circumstances that we are living under today allows everybody in the state to be able to cast an absentee ballot. And she, I believe, is making plans to send one to every voter in the state. And so while it wouldn't technically be a mail-in vote, many of us believe that that's the way to go, and it would give everybody in the state the option to cast the equivalent of a mail-in vote. At the federal level, I think we've got to, move to a system in which every state has that option in order to, just acknowledge the fact that this probably won't be the last election in which we're dealing with a crisis like this. But in Connecticut, we've got a pathway, albeit a narrow pathway, to make sure that folks don't have to show up to the polls in November in order to cast their vote. Great. Take another question.
Absolutely. Our next question is from Becca Huston. Becca, you are live. Please go ahead.
Hi, it's Becca Houston. And first of all, I want to thank you, Senator Murphy, for publishing your daily newsletter. It's been really helpful to me, and I've liked reading it. I'm looking forward to it on email.
Great.
Secondly, this is just a personal question, but I'm retired on Social Security, and everybody around me, including my ex-husband, received their stimulus check today. I did not, and obviously I get direct deposit through Social Security, so my bank information is known. Are other people experiencing this, or how do I go about finding out what's going on? Because I'm upset.
Yeah, let me take a shot at that. Thank you, Becca, for the question. You're absolutely right. If you are receiving a Social Security payment, that will be the mechanism by which you get the economic impact payment. That's the $1,200 you're referring to. Couple of observations for you. One, the numbers as of today, there have been 88 million payments nationally and just shy of 1 million in the state of Connecticut. Now, we've got 3.5 million people in the state, so and if you exclude minors who don't qualify for the $1,200 payment, you can see that we're not anywhere close to being done with the distribution of those payments. Now, one thing I would point out, there is a little, not a glitch, but there's an additional step for anybody who's a recipient of Social Security payments and has a dependent. It's a little bit more complicated for you, and I don't know if it's probably smart for me to pause here. Do you actually have a dependent? Okay, maybe
unfortunately, she is no longer live on the line with us. However,
oh, okay, she's not live.
At the end of the call.
No, quite all right. But for anybody who is on Social Security who has a dependent, there is a need to let the Social Security Administration, the IRS, know that you have that dependent. And there's a very simple form on IRS.gov that you can go to indicate that you are a Social Security recipient, that you have a dependent under 17, and that should do the trick. So 2 points. One, though many people have gotten them, there is a capacity restriction on the ability of the government to get out that much money that quickly. So I guess I would recommend to Ms. Houston, if you don't fall into that category of having a dependent and therefore needing to go to the IRS.gov website, give it a little bit more time. And if time goes by and you still haven't gotten it, reach out to one of our offices. We are spending a lot of time tracking down payments for people who have particular reasons for not being able to receive their economic impact payment right away.
And I just also note there is a functionality on the IRS website whereby you can check the status of your payment. I think I've heard enough mixed reviews and experiences with that function to know that it's imperfect, but it's at least another option for you in the meantime to go and try to get an update. All right. Do we have time for one more?
Sure thing.
All right, let's do one more question.
Perfect. Is going to be from Tom Mariconda. Tom, you are live on the call. Please go ahead with your question.
Yes, to both Senator Murphy and Congressman Himes. I'm tending to being very concerned about the WHO funding, and I know that Congress may not have as much influence there, but I was just curious what is contemplating being done to sort of help those countries where the pandemic, with the WHO funding being cut by the president.
Well, I mean, I have very strong feelings on this. I'm getting some feedback. Hold on. All right. So the worst thing you can do in the middle of a pandemic is to cut funding for the one international relief agency in the healthcare space that confronts pandemics. The WHO isn't perfect, just like every other major international organization, but they're unique. There's no other international aid organization like it that puts every single country at the table to try to come up with common rules to respond to these kind of outbreaks. And if the president is cutting off funding for the WHO because he's angry that China has a lot of influence there, then he's essentially creating more of the problem he's trying to solve, because China just announced that they are increasing their contribution to the WHO to make up for the loss of U.S. funding. And guess what? China will then have more influence at the WHO and will be able to set the international rules when it comes to pandemic response. And that doesn't mean more transparency and more free flow of information. That means more secrecy and less transmission of information. I spent some time on the phone today with Lindsey Graham, who's a friend and a colleague, and he runs the Appropriations Subcommittee in the Senate that oversees the WHO. And we had a pretty frank conversation today about how perhaps in this next relief package that we've been talking about on this call, we can include some pretty substantial new funding for international public health programming. Whether or not we can convince the president to restart the funding is another matter, but there may be some other ways that we can get some money to these developing nations that right now are dealing with outbreaks and don't have the ability to confront the outbreaks. Remember, this disease doesn't care, this virus doesn't care about international borders, and we could turn the corner here in Connecticut. But if there's a refugee camp on the other side of the world where there's a massive outbreak, that can get back to the United States very, very quickly. That travel ban didn't do much. And so we know that borders and travel restrictions ultimately aren't sufficient to protect us. So some of us are working on workarounds, and in the meantime, we'll continue to try to pressure the president to do better here. Let me turn it over to Jim for some answer to that question and maybe some closing thoughts.
Yeah, no, I think you covered it pretty well, Chris. It's no secret that the president, He's not an internationalist. He doesn't sort of believe in international cooperation. And look, there's lots of fair debates about that. We have lots of debates about free trade. We have lots of debates about the United Nations generally, and those are good debates. It's really not a good debate, as Chris so rightly pointed out, when we're talking about a virus that, you cannot name a country so obscure that it is not, struggling with exactly the same coronavirus problem that we're struggling with here in Fairfield County. So on this matter, you really don't have any choice. And I would just point back, one of the things that should make us proud of the way we have dealt with these things in the past, in the previous administration, when there was a significant and scary outbreak of the Ebola disease in Africa, boy, did we go to work. We sent military into Central Africa. We sent healthcare experts, and we did that, of course, because we knew it could come here, and in fact it did. There were a couple of cases here in the United States, but because we really leaned forward and did not see those political borders, in the end, we had 2 cases, I guess, here in the United States, but that was an experience that was very, very different than the one that we're having now, and I think we can learn from the necessity of engaging. So on that positive note, let me thank Senator Murphy again for this conversation. It really does my heart a lot of good to know that both of our senators are they cover the whole state, but they both understand that the epicenter is really down here in Fairfield County, and I know they've been very aggressive about working with the hospitals and the community health centers and the first responders on everything from getting the legislation right to making sure that we've got adequate PPE, which we don't quite yet have, but we're doing better than we were a couple of weeks ago. And so I would just close again by thanking Senator Murphy for arranging this. Thank you all for participating. And please also think of us, we both have staffs, and those staffs are working 24/7 right now on issues related to Social Security, issues of economic impact payments not arriving, issues of immigration issues that have been caught up in the pause that has been put on in place. So don't think of us just as your representatives, but we do have staffs who are working very, very hard to try to solve the problems that people didn't imagine they would have 2 months ago. So thank you for participating, and think of us as a resource.
Let me just second that. We are, trying to model the right behavior. Thus, our staffs are teleworking, but we pick up our emails and our phone messages multiple times a day, and we are all of our teams are working literally around the clock to try to help as many people as we can. So do reach out to us for that help. We're a small state, which means we have a small delegation. There's 7 of us, 5 in the House, Jim representing Fairfield County, Dick and I in the Senate. And I have to say, I think we work together about as well as any delegation in the country, and we also work really closely with our governor. We both mentioned being on the phone with the governor and the governor's staff on a near daily basis, and this feedback you've given us tonight, and that hopefully you'll also provide if you leave a message after the call, will help inform us as we, try to fight this together. So really grateful for all of being on the call, and we're grateful for the opportunity to give us to serve the state in Washington. So everybody stay safe, have a great night, and please keep in touch.